The prison hallways belonged to the bullies. Everyone knew it. Inmates, guards. Even the walls felt like they'd learned to look away. So when the new cleaner showed up, no one paid him much attention. Gray uniform, plastic gloves, pushing a cart that squeaked with every step. He was older than most, thicker around the waist. The kind of man people assume will apologize before you even touch him. That's why they chose him. A foot shot out, tipping his bucket. Soapy water spread across the floor. "Hey, janitor!" One of them laughed. "You missed a spot." Another stepped closer, poking a finger into his chest. "You clean slow, or you just stupid." The cleaner didn't answer. He crouched down and began wringing out the mop, slowly, like he didn't hear them, like he didn't feel the circle tightening around him. The laughter grew louder. Then one of them shoved him from behind. The cleaner stopped moving. He stood up, not rushed, not angry, just aligned. A guard at the end of the corridor frowned. Something about that posture felt wrong. Too balanced, too centered. The bully cracked his neck. "What are you gonna do, mop me to death?" The cleaner finally spoke. His voice was calm, flat, almost polite. "Please don't make me do this at work." The bullies laughed. They didn't see the way his hands rose, not clenched, not shaking, but loose, ready. They didn't hear the shift in the room. The way sound itself seemed to pull back, because that wasn't the stance of a cleaner. It was the stance of a man who had stood in rings, under lights, with blood on the canvas, and learned exactly how long it takes to end a fight. And in the next few seconds, everyone in that hallway was about to learn it too. Stay with me until the end, because what this janitor does next inside that prison will make even the guards question who really controls that place. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The man pushing that squeaky cart through the corridors of Milbrook Correctional Facility went by Frank Rodriguez now. Just Frank to the inmates who bothered acknowledging him at all. To the guards, he was employee number 749. To the administration, he was a tax write-off, part of their prisoner rehabilitation program that looked good on quarterly reports. But 15 years ago, Frank Rodriguez had been something else entirely. Something the boxing world called Lightning Frank, a middleweight contender who could end fights with combinations so fast they looked choreographed. 37 professional victories, 28 knockouts, a left hook that sports commentators described as surgical precision wrapped in dynamite. The fall had been swift and brutal, not in the ring, but outside it. Bad investments, worse friends, a gambling problem that devoured everything he'd earned throwing punches. The final blow came when his accountant disappeared with what remained of his savings, leaving Frank with debt collectors, unpaid taxes, and a cocaine habit that had started as performance enhancement and ended as survival mechanism. The judge had been surprisingly lenient. 5 years for tax evasion and possession with intent to distribute. Could have been worse. Should have been worse, Frank knew. But his lawyer had played up the fallen hero angle, and the media attention had worked in his favor. Now, 3 years into his sentence, Frank had found something resembling peace in the monotony of mopping floors and scrubbing toilets. The work was honest, simple. Nobody expected anything from him except clean surfaces and emptied trash bins. After a lifetime of people demanding he hurt other human beings for entertainment, there was strange comfort in making things cleaner instead of bloodier. The other inmates barely registered his existence. Frank preferred it that way. He'd learned early that reputation in prison was a double-edged sword. Too weak, and you became prey. Too strong, and you became a target for every wannabe tough guy looking to make a name. Invisible was perfect. Invisible was safe. But invisible only worked if everyone agreed to pretend you weren't there. And on this particular Tuesday morning, as Frank pushed his cart down C Block's main corridor, someone had decided the game was over. The 3 men who blocked his path were exactly what central casting would order for generic prison bullies. Derek Mason, the obvious leader, stood 6'2" with arms like tree branches and a neck tattoo that spelled out damage in Gothic letters. His lieutenant, a wiry man called Twitch, bounced on his toes like he'd mainlined espresso for breakfast. The third member, Rico, was built like a refrigerator and had the intellectual curiosity of one. They ruled C-Block through a combination of violence and intimidation that the guards tacitly allowed because it kept the peace. Better to have predictable predators than chaos. Derek's crew controlled the gambling, the contraband cigarettes, and the protection racket that kept smaller inmates safe for a weekly fee paid in commissary items or favors. Frank had managed to avoid their attention for 3 years by being exactly what he appeared to be. A broken-down middle-aged man cleaning floors for 47 cents an hour. No money worth taking. No respect worth stealing. No threat worth eliminating. Until today, apparently. "Well, look what we got here," Derek announced, his voice carrying that particular blend of mockery and menace that bullies perfected in elementary school and never abandoned. The invisible man himself. Frank continued wringing out his mop, water dripping steadily into the yellow bucket. He'd learned that acknowledging bullies early only encouraged them. Sometimes they'd get bored and move on if you offered nothing interesting to work with. "I'm talking to you, cleaner." Derek's tone sharpened. "You been working this block for what, 2 years now? Never once said hello to the people who run things around here." Twitch giggled, a sound like glass breaking. "Maybe he thinks he's too good for us, Derek. Maybe he thinks his mop makes him special." Frank kept his eyes on the floor, methodically swirling the mop in small circles. The soapy water created tiny whirlpools that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. A memory from before this place, before the fall, before everything went wrong. "That's disrespectful," Rico added, his voice a rumbling bass note. Real disrespectful. The truth was simpler than they imagined. Frank didn't talk to them because he'd spent enough time around dangerous men to recognize the type. Derek wasn't truly dangerous, not in the way that mattered. He was dangerous the way a rabid dog was dangerous, unpredictable, vicious, but ultimately limited by his own nature. Real danger was controlled, calculated, patient. Frank had fought real danger. He'd shared rings with men who could end your career with a single, perfectly timed uppercut. Men who studied you for 12 rounds, learning your tells, your weaknesses, your rhythm, before striking with mathematical precision. Derek Mason threw tantrums and called it strength, but explaining that would require talking, and talking would require acknowledging their existence, and acknowledging their existence would change the delicate ecosystem that had kept Frank alive and unnoticed for 3 years. So he kept mopping. That's when Derek's foot shot out, catching the rim of the bucket and sending sudsy water cascading across the freshly cleaned floor. The sound echoed down the corridor like a small waterfall, and Frank watched his morning's work spread in a gray tide toward the cell doors. "Oops," Derek said, grinning wide enough to show 3 gold teeth. "Looks like you missed a spot." Frank straightened slowly, his hands still gripping the mop handle. For just a moment, muscle memory flickered through his nervous system, the way his shoulders should set, how his feet should position, the angle that would give him maximum leverage for a right cross that could travel from his back foot through his hip, up his spine, and into Derek's jaw with enough force to crack bone. Instead, he knelt down and began soaking up the spilled water with his mop, one stroke at a time, methodical, peaceful. "You hearing me, old man?" Derek stepped closer, his shadow falling across Frank's work. "I asked you a question." Frank squeezed water from the mop and dipped it again. The repetitive motion was almost meditative. Dip, squeeze, wipe, repeat. Simple tasks for a simple life. "Maybe he's deaf," Twitch suggested, bouncing on his toes. "Or maybe he's just stupid. You stupid janitor man." That's when Rico decided to escalate things. His meaty hand shot out and shoved Frank hard between the shoulder blades, sending him stumbling forward. The mop handle clattered against the concrete as Frank caught himself with his palms against the wet floor. And something shifted in that corridor. something subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before lightning strikes, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Frank rose to his feet, and for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't invisible anymore. When Frank straightened up from that shove, the change was immediate, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a subtle shift in the way he carried himself that made the air in the corridor feel thicker. Derek noticed it first, the way the older man's shoulders settled, how his breathing remained perfectly controlled despite being surrounded. Most inmates would be sweating by now, stammering apologies or puffing up their chests in false bravado. Frank did neither. "You got something to say now?" Derek pressed, stepping into Frank's personal space, close enough that Frank could smell the instant coffee on his breath, see the small scar above his left eyebrow from some forgotten fight. Frank's response was barely above a whisper. "I said, please don't make me do this at work." Twitch let out another one of his glass-breaking giggles. "Do what, old man? Clean the floor? That's what they pay you for?" But Rico had gone quiet. Something in his limited intelligence was picking up signals that his more volatile companions were missing. The way Frank stood wasn't the posture of a victim. It was the stance of someone who had measured the distance between himself and each potential threat, calculated angles and timing, and found the math acceptable. "You threatening us?" Derek's voice rose, drawing attention from inmates in nearby cells. Faces appeared at the small windows, sensing entertainment about to unfold. "You think because you push a mop around here, you're somebody special?" Frank's hands hung loose at his sides. No fists, no tension, just ready. "I think I'd like to finish my shift without any trouble." "Your shift?" Derek laughed, but the sound carried less confidence than before. "Your shift is whatever we say it is, janitor. You work for us now." That's when Frank made his first mistake in 3 years. He looked Derek directly in the eyes. The bullies had been expecting fear. They'd been counting on submission. What they saw instead was something far more unsettling. Frank's gaze held the kind of calm that comes from having survived much worse than anything Derek Mason could imagine. It was the look of a man who had faced opponents who could actually hurt him, really hurt him, and had walked away victorious more often than not. "Yo, Derek," Rico rumbled, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Maybe we should—" "Should what?" Derek snapped, his authority challenged in front of an audience. "Back down from some washed-up janitor? You losing your nerve, Rico?" But Rico had fought enough real fights to recognize something his leader was missing. The way Frank distributed his weight, the slight angle of his feet, the distance he maintained between himself and each of them. This wasn't a man preparing to be a victim. This was a man preparing to work. Frank tried one more time. "Look, I just want to clean these floors and go back to my cell. No trouble, no problems. Just let me do my job." "Your job," Twitch said, bouncing more aggressively now, "is whatever we tell you it is. Right now, your job is showing us some respect." "How much respect you want?" Frank asked quietly. The question caught Derek off guard. He'd expected pleading or defiance, not negotiation. "What? You want me to say I'm sorry? I'll say I'm sorry. You want me to clean this up faster? I'll clean it up faster. You want commissary money? I got $17 in my account. You can have it." Derek's face flushed red. The offer of submission should have satisfied him, but something in Frank's tone made it sound less like surrender and more like a business transaction, like a man offering to pay a toll to avoid a longer route. "I don't want your money, old man. I want you to understand how things work around here." "I understand," Frank said. "You run this block. You make the rules. I'm just trying to clean floors and stay out of everyone's way." "Then why you standing there like you ready to fight somebody?" Frank looked down at himself, as if genuinely surprised by the observation. "I'm not ready to fight anybody. I'm too old for that nonsense." But his body language told a different story. The way he'd positioned himself gave him clear escape routes while maintaining optimal striking distance. His hands remained relaxed, but ready to move in any direction necessary. Most telling of all, he hadn't backed down an inch despite being outnumbered 3-1. "You know what I think?" Derek said, circling Frank like a predator sizing up prey. I think you're trying to play us, acting all humble and scared, but really you think you're tough. I don't think I'm tough, Frank replied honestly. I think I'm tired. And he was tired. Tired of the constant vigilance required to survive in a place like this. Tired of pretending to be less than he was. Tired of swallowing his pride every time someone decided to use him as entertainment. But mostly, he was tired of running from who he used to be. Well, you about to be a lot more tired, Derek promised, cracking his knuckles with theatrical flair. Because we're going to give you a real workout. The first punch came exactly as Frank expected it would, telegraphed from Derek's shoulder, thrown with anger instead of technique, aimed at intimidation rather than maximum damage. In the old days, Frank would have slipped it so cleanly that Derek would have stumbled past him into the wall. Instead, Frank absorbed the blow on his forearm, letting the impact spin him slightly to the right. To the casual observer, it looked like Derek's punch had landed flush and staggered the older man. In reality, Frank had redirected 90% of the force while positioning himself perfectly for what came next. That's what you get for disrespecting us, Derek announced to his audience, flexing for the inmates watching from their cells. But Frank wasn't staggered. He was measuring. The way Derek dropped his guard after throwing a punch. How Twitch telegraphed his movements with that constant bouncing. Where Rico positioned himself in relation to the others. Old habits were surfacing. The analytical mind that had studied opponents for 12 rounds, looking for patterns, weaknesses, opportunities. Derek threw punches like he was swatting flies. Twitch moved like he was powered by nervous energy instead of controlled aggression. Rico was strong but slow, and he favored his right side because of an old injury that showed in the way he shifted his weight. You done learned your lesson, janitor? Derek asked, shaking out his hand. The punch had hurt him more than he'd expected. Frank's forearm had felt like hitting a tree trunk. Frank straightened his uniform shirt and reached for his mop. Yes, sir. Lesson learned. But as he bent down to retrieve his cleaning supplies, Derek made his second mistake of the encounter. He interpreted Frank's compliance as weakness rather than strategy. Not so fast, Derek said, kicking the mop across the corridor. We ain't finished with your education yet. That's when Frank realized the performance was over. They weren't going to let him walk away with his dignity intact. They needed a complete victory, a total humiliation, something they could talk about for weeks to maintain their reputation. Frank stood up slowly, and this time he didn't try to hide what he was. The mask of the humble janitor slipped away, replaced by something harder, something forged in gymnasiums and refined in rings where men fought for more than just dominance. Please, he said one final time, don't make me do this. Derek laughed, but the sound came out forced. Something had changed in Frank's posture, and every instinct Derek had developed during his years in the system was suddenly screaming warnings. Do what, old man? You gonna mop us to death? Frank's hands rose from his sides, not clenched into fists, not raised in surrender, just positioned where they could move fastest when the time came. No, Frank said quietly. I'm going to show you why they used to call me Lightning. Derek's confidence cracked the moment Frank mentioned that name. Lightning. Every boxing fan from the late 2000s knew that name. The middleweight who could end fights before his opponents knew they'd started. You're full of shit, Derek said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Lightning Frank retired years ago. Lightning Frank went to prison. Frank corrected quietly. I'm just the janitor now. Twitch stopped bouncing. Rico took a half step backward. Even the inmates watching from their cells had gone silent, sensing something electric building in the corridor. Derek's pride wouldn't let him back down, not with an audience. I don't care if you're Muhammad Ali's ghost. You're in my house now, and you're gonna learn respect. He threw another punch, this one with more technique behind it. Frank didn't block it or slip it. He simply wasn't there when it arrived. The movement was so fluid it looked like Derek had punched through smoke. Frank's response was surgical, a short left hook that traveled maybe 8 inches, catching Derek just below the ribs. The punch looked gentle, almost lazy, but Derek's eyes went wide as the air exploded from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping like a fish on dry land. "That's the liver," Frank explained conversationally, as if he was teaching a class. "Hurts worse than getting hit in the face, but there's no permanent damage. You'll be fine in about 30 seconds. Twitch rushed in from the side, swinging wild haymakers. Frank stepped into the attack, his shoulder absorbing one punch while his forearm deflected another. His right hand found Twitch's solar plexus with pinpoint accuracy. Twitch collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest and making small, whimpering sounds. "Solar plexus," Frank noted to Rico, who was still frozen in place. "Temporarily paralyzes the diaphragm. He can't breathe for a minute or two, but no lasting harm." Rico looked at his two fallen comrades, then at Frank, then at the emergency alarm button 20 feet down the corridor. Frank followed his gaze and shook his head slightly. "Don't make this worse than it has to be," Frank said. "Help your friends. They'll recover." But Derek was already struggling to his feet, his face purple with rage and oxygen deprivation. "You think you're smart, old man? You think this is over?" Frank picked up his mop and began cleaning the spilled water again. "I think you should get those ribs looked at. That punch was harder than it needed to be." "This ain't over," Derek wheezed, leaning heavily against the wall. "You hear me? This ain't over." "Yes, it is," Frank said without looking up from his mopping. "Because if it's not over, I'll have to stop holding back." The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone Frank might use to discuss the weather, but something in his voice made Derek's blood run cold. The realization hit him that everything Frank had just done was controlled, measured, professional. "You was holding back?" Rico asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank wrung out his mop and looked at the three men with something approaching pity. "In the ring, I had to hurt people to win. That was the job. Here, I just want to clean floors and serve my time. But if you make this personal, if you force me to fight for real, someone's going to the hospital." He resumed his cleaning, methodically working around their feet as if they were furniture. Derek watched him work, seeing something he'd missed before. The way Frank moved wasn't just confident. It was economical. Every motion served a purpose. No wasted energy. No unnecessary flourishes. "How many people you killed?" Twitch asked from his position on the floor. "Never killed nobody," Frank replied. "But I put 17 men to sleep in the ring, and that was when I was following rules." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Derek's crew controlled C-Block through intimidation and numbers. But intimidation only worked on people who could be intimidated, and numbers only mattered if you could use them effectively. Frank finished cleaning around them and moved his cart further down the corridor. As he walked away, his voice carried back to them. "Next time you see me coming, just nod and keep walking. That's all the respect I need." Word spread through Milbrook like wildfire. By evening count, every inmate knew the story. The quiet janitor who'd embarrassed Derek's crew without breaking a sweat. Some details got exaggerated in the telling. Others got whispered with religious reverence. Frank ate his dinner alone, same as always. But the cafeteria felt different. Conversations stopped when he passed. Eyes followed his movements. Some inmates nodded respectfully. Others gave him wide berth, unsure whether the legend was friendly or dangerous. Derek's crew sat at their usual table, but the swagger was gone. Derek picked at his food with his left hand, his right arm still tender from where Frank's punch had rattled his ribcage. Twitch stared at his tray without eating. Rico kept glancing toward Frank's table with something approaching reverence. "We can't let this slide," Derek muttered. "People are going to think we're weak." "Maybe we are weak," Rico said quietly. "Compared to him, anyway." Derek's face flushed. "He caught us off guard. Next time will be different." But even as he said it, Derek knew there wouldn't be a next time. Not from him. Not directly. The memory of that liver punch was too fresh. The casual way Frank had dismantled them without even breathing hard. "There's other ways," Derek said finally. "Guards can be bought. Accidents can be arranged. Nobody's untouchable in here." Twitch looked up from his untouched food. "You really want to go to war with Lightning Frank?" "I want to survive in here," Derek snapped. "And I can't survive if every punk thinks they can disrespect me because some washed-up boxer got lucky." But Derek's words carried less fire than usual. Deep down, he understood what Rico and Twitch had already figured out. Frank hadn't gotten lucky. Frank had been merciful, and mercy from someone that dangerous was more terrifying than anger from someone weak. 3 tables away, Frank finished his mashed potatoes and wondered how long he had before Derek's wounded pride forced another confrontation. Prison politics were predictable. Derek couldn't afford to look weak, which meant he'd have to retaliate somehow. The only question was how and when. Frank had hoped 3 years of invisibility would carry him through to his release date. 18 months left on his sentence if he kept his nose clean. But clean noses were a luxury for men who didn't accidentally remind people they used to be dangerous. As he carried his tray to the wash station, Frank caught sight of himself in the metal reflection of a serving counter. For just a moment, he didn't see the middle-aged janitor with the gray uniform and tired eyes. He saw Lightning Frank Rodriguez, the man who'd once made grown men afraid to enter a boxing ring. That man had been buried under 3 years of mopping floors and keeping his head down. But Derek's stupidity had cracked the grave open, and now Frank wasn't sure he could put that ghost back to rest. The next morning brought new challenges. Frank's usual routine of early cleaning was interrupted by whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. Inmates who'd never spoken to him before nodded respectfully. Others crossed to the other side of corridors to avoid his path. But the most telling change was in the guards. Officer Martinez, who supervised the cleaning crew, looked at Frank differently during the morning briefing. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the kind of careful attention you'd give a sleeping tiger. "Rodriguez," Martinez said after dismissing the other cleaners. "Word is you had some excitement yesterday." Frank continued organizing his supplies. "Just doing my job, sir." "Your job is cleaning floors, not fighting inmates." "Yes, sir. That's why I tried to avoid it." Martinez studied Frank's face, looking for signs of trouble. What he saw instead was the same tired compliance Frank had shown for 3 years. But now Martinez knew it was a performance. The question was whether Frank's act was protection for the other inmates or for himself. "Derek Mason's crew filed a complaint," Martinez continued. "Says you assaulted them without provocation." Frank looked up from his cart. "That what they say happened? That's what they wrote in their statement. Course, funny thing about their story. Security cameras don't quite match their version of events." Frank resumed his work. The cameras in C Block were old and positioned poorly, but they would have caught the basic sequence. Derek's crew surrounding him, the spilled bucket, the shoving, and Frank defending himself with minimal force. "You want to tell me your side?" Martinez asked. "They knocked over my bucket. I cleaned it up. Sometimes accidents happen when people get too close to wet floors." The explanation was masterfully neutral. Frank acknowledged the incident without admitting fault or casting blame. Just a workplace mishap between professionals. Martinez almost smiled. In 15 years of corrections work, he'd heard every excuse, threat, and sob story imaginable. Frank's calm deflection was refreshingly honest in its dishonesty. "Well, try to keep your accidents to a minimum," Martinez said finally. "Prison's dangerous enough without slippery floors." "Yes, sir. Safety first." But as Frank pushed his cart toward the morning's assignments, both men knew the real conversation had nothing to do with wet floors. Frank had demonstrated that he could handle himself if pressed. Martinez had acknowledged that some demonstrations were more justified than others, and now they both understood the new rules of engagement. The morning passed quietly until Frank reached the prison library. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, looked up nervously as he entered with his cleaning supplies. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Frank said, same as always. "Good morning, Frank." She paused, clearly wanting to say more. Are you all right? I heard there was some trouble yesterday." Frank began dusting the bookshelves with methodical precision. "No trouble, ma'am. Just a misunderstanding. The other inmates, they're saying you used to be a professional fighter. Frank's hand stilled on the shelf for just a moment. Used to be a lot of things, Mrs. Henderson. Now I'm just a janitor who likes to read. She watched him work, noting the careful way he moved around the furniture. Not clumsy or uncertain, but deliberate, like a man who understood exactly how much space his body occupied and what it could do within that space. "Were you really lightning Frank Rodriguez?" she asked quietly. Frank turned to face her, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't deflect the question. "Long time ago. Different life. I remember watching you fight on television. My late husband was a boxing fan. You were magnificent." The word hung in the air between them. Magnificent. Frank couldn't remember the last time anyone had used that word to describe him. Certainly not since his arrest. Not since the fall from grace that had brought him to this place. "That was somebody else," Frank said finally. "I'm just trying to serve my time and stay out of trouble." "But you can't, can you? Stay out of trouble, I mean. Not after yesterday." Frank resumed his dusting, but Mrs. Henderson's words followed him around the library. She was right, of course. Prison ecosystems were delicate things. You could be invisible for years, but once you became visible, you stayed visible. And visible meant vulnerable. Derek's crew wouldn't forget what happened. More importantly, they couldn't afford to forget. Their reputation was built on the fear of consequences. If word spread that an old janitor had embarrassed them without repercussions, their authority would crumble, which meant Frank had maybe days before they tried again. Next time with weapons, next time with allies, next time with the kind of planning that turned prison fights into prison murders. Frank finished the library and moved on to his next assignment, acutely aware that his 18 months to freedom had just become the longest year and a half of his life. Derek's face went white as Frank's words sank in. Lightning. Frank Rodriguez wasn't just a name anymore. It was a promise wrapped in a gray uniform, standing in a prison corridor with a mop in his hands, and 18 months left to serve. The weeks that followed changed everything at Milbrook. Frank went back to his cleaning routine, but the prison had shifted around him. Inmates nodded when he passed. Guards watched with new respect, and Derek's crew learned to find other corridors when they saw that squeaky cart approaching. Frank never threw another punch. He didn't have to. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is remind people who you used to be, because in a place where reputation is everything, being a legend beats being invisible every single time. The bullies had learned a lesson that would echo through those concrete walls long after Frank walked free. Never judge a man by the uniform he wears or the mop he pushes, because you never know when you might be picking a fight with lightning itself. And sometimes, just sometimes, lightning strikes twice in the same place.